Hello and welcome to Very Academy. My name is Xander. In this tutorial, we focus in on Nginx cache serving Django web pages. More specifically in this tutorial, we take a look at the vary header and its role on cache key generation. And that's going to take us down a path where we start to look at configuring Nginx to ignore specific header data, and then it allows us to go a little bit deeper into more Django specifics. In this tutorial, we take a look at how to configure which request headers a cache mechanism should take into account from a Django project, and then also control how caching is performed using Django header directives. To fully engage with the content in this tutorial, it is advised for you to have some general working knowledge working with a Django project, and it would be advisable for you to watch the previous tutorial in this series. So go ahead, if you haven't found the tutorial series so far, go ahead to the main channel, go to playlists, and you're looking for the Nginx Mastery series. In this tutorial, we do start from baseline code, which we developed in the previous tutorial, and all that obviously has been explained in the previous tutorial, so it'd be well worth having a look at that. And that is tutorial 5 in this series. So that's the previous tutorial. So go ahead and have a look at that first if you want to know a little bit more about the baseline settings that we start with in this tutorial. Now we are going to be utilizing Docker again in this tutorial. So you're going to need to have Docker installed if you haven't already done so. And here we're using Visual Studio Code and some extensions. So notably, we're utilizing the Docker extension in this tutorial just to make things nice and simple for you to follow along. There are essentially 5 stages in this tutorial, and I will try and break this down in the video description so you can skip ahead if you want to. But first of all, we're going to start with a simple setup. There is some code, which you'll find a link in the video description. Go ahead and download the previous tutorial's code. We're going to start from that as a baseline, and then we'll go ahead and explore the default behavior. So we'll have a look at understanding the default behavior of utilizing Nginx cache serving Django web pages. From there, we'll delve into the vary header, understanding what it is, and potentially then how to configure that as a baseline in Nginx when serving Django web pages. And then finally, we have a look at some of the different Django cache configurations and options that are available when building a Django project and controlling cache. So just before we get started, just to recognize all the members and supporters of this channel, thank you very much. It is always very appreciated. If you are thinking about supporting our channel further, you can do through the channel membership scheme or potentially following us on Patreon. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to join the community, you can follow us on many of these socials. Just a little bit of setup here for this tutorial. There is a link in the video description which will take you over to the Nginx Mastery series code on GitHub, and go ahead and clone this down, or just go ahead and download this. And what we're going to need is the part 5 code. So download, open up part 5 folder, and then maybe copy that to a new folder, the code inside of there, and open that in Visual Studio Code. So once you've gone ahead and opened up part 5 in Visual Studio Code, then you're going to find a range of different files here. And this represents what we've been developing over the last couple of tutorials. Now, don't worry if you don't understand this fully. At this point, I will explain everything you need to know to meet the objectives of this tutorial. So let's get this started. Now, you are going to need Docker installed because we're going to start that up shortly. So go ahead and do that if you haven't already got Docker desktop. All right, so first thing then, we're going to need to build an environment folder. So that's something that's missing. So a new folder, .env. So these are just some environment variables that Django requires. It's just how we've set up Django. So here then we're going to have dev.env, and then what you'll find, hopefully, if not, probably not, in the commands here, I was going to just go ahead and copy across the commands we need for this file here. So basically just 4 different variables that we're going to set here: secret key, allowed host, and debug equals 1. So that needs to go in here. So Django's basically just going to pick up these environment variables from this file in order to get Django started. If you're not familiar with environment variables, it's a way of basically removing some of the critical sensitive information from the Django project and put it into a file or area where you can secure and keep it the data secure away from plain sight. So this is obviously just a demo application. Right, so with that in place, you can use anything for a secret key. Allowed host, just make sure it's 127.0.0.1, and then debug equals 1. Okay, so with that in place, we can now go ahead and start this project. I do have Docker Desktop installed, so you can see there's no images or containers, so it's completely fresh. So let's go ahead and just type in Python, sorry, Docker compose, and then up, and that should go ahead and build from the Docker compose file, and then bring up those containers. So there should be 3 containers. Just ignore the DNS containers for now if you've not seen the previous tutorials. It will be irrelevant in this tutorial, but once everything's up and running, I do have the Docker extension here. You can see that all the containers are running correctly. So make sure that you have this green star icon here. That indicates that the containers are working correctly. So from there, you just need to type in 127, and then we don't need the port. You'll just need to run that from 127.0.0.1. And you can see this project is really simple. There are 3 kind of endpoints here. So let's just go to P1 for P1. There we go. So there's just 2 pages here, or endpoints, page 1 and page 2. So that should now be working okay. So we've just gone ahead and created 3 containers. One has a DNF server, which you can just ignore in this tutorial. We have the Nginx service in a container, and then we have the Gunicorn, and Django with SQLite within a container. And what's happening here from our browser, we're requesting the web page that's been sent to Nginx server. That then request has been forwarded across because this is a reverse proxy setup here on the Nginx server. That gets sent across, and then Gunicorn then takes that request and then passes it along to the Django instance. At that point, Django then checks your request and then serves the web page. Now, the first time your web page returns back through the Nginx server, Nginx goes ahead and puts a copy of that information into cache, and then goes ahead and serves that page back to the browser. So that's the first time, the first request of a single page. The second request of that page, what happens is that your request will go to the Nginx server. It matches that request to a cache key in the cache, and then goes ahead and serves that page from cache. So that's currently the setup here. And again, in the previous tutorial, we basically set up this configuration, and we're going to be working from this baseline. So let's just take a look, if you haven't seen it, the configuration for this and the folder and files here. So we have the Docker compose file, which is kind of building all the containers for this configuration. And then in the Docker compose file here, we have a few different volumes where we're mapping over some folders to make it easier for us to work with some of the configuration files. And one of them is the confd file here, or the default configuration file here in Nginx. And basically what you're looking at here is the configuration, or a current configuration that we've set up for Nginx. And you can see that we've set this up for a reverse proxy, which means we're passing this over to our upstream server, which is on web 8000 port. So we're just passing all the data over to Django, and that's being managed and handled by the Gunicorn server. Okay, so we're listening on port 80. You can see here what we've set up in the previous tutorial is that in actual fact, we wait for 5 requests for the same resource in order for us to then cache that page. So I'm just going to remove that for now. Okay, right. So you can also see that the page here, the P1 page, the proxy has been turned off. So we've disabled the cache for that page. That was set up in the previous tutorial. So I'm just going to remove that there. From that configuration. So we're just going to cache everything for now. Right, so with that done, let's just go ahead, and I'm just going to use the Docker extension here to go into my Nginx server, attach a shell. I can just go ahead and just reload this if I wanted to, the container, or I can use the command here, reload. So that's just going to reload on the fly the configuration. So with that done, alternatively, you can just go ahead and restart. So here I'm using Chrome. So we go ahead and just have a look at the default configuration for this. So let's go into Chrome. I'm just going to go to this page again. Now we haven't served page 2 yet. So I'm just going to press F12. That's going to bring up the console. I'm going to select the network tab here, which is going to give me information about the page loading. So let's just go ahead and refresh, and you can see that we've served this page here. And what we're looking for, again, demonstrated in the previous tutorial, explained in the previous tutorial, what we're looking for here is we're sending across X-frame options, and it says deny here. So this page is being denied from being cached at the moment. So let's just go ahead and go to page 2. Now remember, the first time we served this page, it shouldn't be put into the cache, and you can see here it says X proxy cache miss. So that means that this page hasn't been served from our proxy server, from our Nginx cache. And if I go ahead and run this page again, this time, because we've made the initial request, that was served and saved then in Nginx cache. And this time the page is being served from Nginx cache because we have the X proxy cache hit. So that pretty much concludes the setup process. So let's now explore the default behavior of Nginx when saving and serving Django web pages. So hopefully we've got the basic understanding here of this X proxy cache option here, parameter attribute, which is essentially just telling us whether our page is being served from cache or not. So hit, that's indicating that this page is being served from cache, and then basically deny means maybe we've prevented that page from being cached, and then miss being the page hasn't been served from cache. So page 1, maybe we've already served this, I can't remember. Yeah, so here we got miss, so this page hasn't been served. Remember, it's the first time we requested this page. So now Nginx has now saved that into cache. So when we subsequently request this page, it should now be served from cache. Here we go, so it now says X proxy hit. Now the reason why we're seeing that header option is because we've set it here in our default configuration, add header X proxy cache. So that's what's returning this X proxy cache information. And of course we can turn that off in production, as it's really just providing us some diagnostic information. So let's take a look at a potential problem we have here. Right, so I'm just going to go ahead in Chrome and create a new incognito window. And then I'll just bring this down a little bit here, and we'll have this side by side. So here we're going to simulate a new user accessing the same web page. Now you would imagine potentially that because we've already saved this page in cache, then the next person who comes along, that page should be served from cache. That's kind of the point of potentially utilizing cache, so that we don't have to send a signal all the way back to Django and process the same request multiple times. It's going to be a lot quicker serving a page from our cache potentially, rather than going through that whole process. So let's just try this out and see if this works. So we're going to need to actually go into our console and get that ready. So we'll go ahead and serve that page. And now let's go to the page. We've just been to P1 here on this side. Notice that it has been saved in cache. So let's go ahead and serve that page again. And this time, notice what happens is we get a miss. So this page, this new user, our Nginx server isn't serving this page from cache by default. And in actual fact, if we refresh this page, it does then get served by cache. It says hit here. So this type of behavior isn't going to be desirable if you are thinking to set up Nginx cache per page rather than per user. Now let me explain what's happening here. So the default setup here is that potentially we want to allow the user to send a request to the server. Now the first time the user does that, it's going to send a signal all the way back to the Unicorn server, and Django is then going to process that request. Obviously what we're trying to do here by serving data from cache is that we only want to do that process once if we're serving multiple static pages potentially to multiple users, because it's going to be a lot quicker for us to serve a web page from cache rather than having to process that page multiple times and having to serve it from our database and so on. So having it already in cache just to send back to the browser for multiple users is maybe desirable in your scenario. So the current setup here then, or the default baseline configuration here, is that the first user is sending the request, it's being processed, and then that's been stored in cache and then gets returned to the user. The second time that individual user makes the same request, that information is then stored in cache and returned back to that user. Now the problem we have here is that the next user comes along and then requests the same page, but Nginx does not serve that page from cache directly. It then makes the request, Django processes it, and then that goes into cache. And then basically what we have here is we have a cache situation per user, which means that we cache based upon the user, or per user, rather than, for example, per page. So potentially what we want to have is a setup whereby a page, say page 1, is cached initially, and then any other request from any other user will then get served that page from cache, rather than it going through this process again. Now, for us to understand what's happening here in Django, we need to understand two things: the vary header and also cache key creation. Let's start off by understanding what HTTP headers are, the basics of HTTP headers. Now, generally, in our browser, we type in a domain name and then we send a HTTP GET request to a server, and that serves the resources back to our browser. Now, this HTTP GET request is typically a message to the server, a location, which then the server is able to utilize then to serve the correct resource back to the browser. So when we're sending messages from our browser to the server, HTTP headers lets the client, our browser, and the server pass additional information with the HTTP request or response. So we can just think of HTTP headers as metadata, additional data that can be passed between the client and the server. Now, if you press F12 in Chrome, or if you're using Safari, you can utilize the console there. You can see if we go over to the network here, we've seen previously that we have some additional information here. So we can go ahead and inspect not only the response headers, but also the request headers, the requests that we've sent to the server, and the additional metadata that we sent to the server. So this is all additional information that we're sending, and it's critical to understand this, to understand the behavior that we're experiencing with the default setup here with the Nginx cache and Django. So if we drill down a little bit further here in the headers, there's a lot of information here, but we're not going to go into any more detail here. What we're going to be concentrating on here is the vary setting here. And you can see that that vary here has been set to cookie. So the question to start off then is, what exactly is the vary header? The vary header allows us to specify a list of header names. So the vary header, if we go back into our browser, we can see in our browser here, the vary header is just specifying another header option, cookie. So down here, you can see we have the other header option, cookie. Now, this vary setting could include multiple different options, but essentially it's just pointing, just indicating other headers that exist in our header. So as you mentioned, the vary header allows us to specify a list of header names. And these values or these headers can then be utilized by cache tools such as the Nginx cache to create cache keys. So this example here, imagine this user is French and they've got a browser and it's configured with the French language by default. So whenever we send a HTTP GET request over, some of the information in the header will determine the fact that that user is using French language by default. So that's all good and well, but potentially we can use this vary header to change the response from our server or from our cache to determine what page to send back or what resource to send back. So the whole idea is that our browser has sent across a request for a web page, and then we've sent in the vary header, we've sent accept language, which is referring to the header which defines the current language of that browser, for example. So what's happening here is our web server, our Nginx server, can read that vary header, and because it's in vary, we're saying, oh, this is important. So the Nginx server can have a look at this and then utilize this header information, in this case accept language, to actually then serve different web pages to this browser. So if you imagine someone else comes along and maybe is using the Italian language, in their HTTP request, in their accept language header, they will have the Italian setting. So instead of your cache or your web server now serving the French website, it now serves the Italian. And that basically then allows us to maybe cache different pages, because in our cache we might want to save the French version, and we might want to serve and save the Italian version in cache. So Vari allows our web server or our cache server to generate keys, generate individual cache pages for individual settings that might be needed by different browsers. So let's just go back into our headers here, and we can see if we go down to our headers, we should be able to see the language header I've just pointed out. Okay, accept language, and you can see here by default I'm set to ENGB, English. So hopefully now we've established that the Vari header allows us to specify a list of header names, and these values can then be utilized by our cache server to generate different pages or cache different pages based upon these different settings. Now let's convert that into our findings about serving web pages with Django. Notice here that the Vari has been set by Django to cookie. So now we have the answer as to why Django and Nginx was serving individual cached pages to individual users, rather than caching one page and then using that to serve to multiple users. So what's happening here is that our user, say user 1, goes ahead and creates a request to serve page 1 from Django. Now that request gets sent across, and then Django adds the cookie header in Vari and then serves that back over to Nginx. Now Nginx reads that response. It then looks at the Vari header, and then it utilizes that information that's been set in the Vari header to create a cache key. So it then creates a cache key, and that key essentially matches the request to the data that's been cached. So it creates a cache key, and it includes the cookie. Now the reason why it includes the cookie information is because it's been told to in the Vari header by Django that was placed in the header. So it utilizes the URL and the cookie information. Now that cookie information at the moment is essentially unique per user. So this user 1 has got this individual cookie information, and that's unique to that user. So whenever this cache is being created for that individual page, that's then going to create a unique cache key that's going to be unique for that individual user. So when that user then goes ahead and makes the same request again, the Nginx server matches the cache key with the information from the header request. And then it knows that that user has already been to that page, and then it can then serve that information from cache rather than it being served from the back end here. Now the problem is when a new user comes along and makes the same request, the problem is here that the cookie that they're provided is going to be different from the first user. So therefore, when Nginx looks at the request from the second user or the third or fourth user, then it doesn't match the cache key that's currently being stored in Nginx server, and then it doesn't serve that cache information back to that user. It then goes ahead and does the cycle again and makes a new cache entry with this browser, this user's cookie, which is slightly different, and then the URL again. So therefore, when the second user then makes a second request, then Nginx then utilizes and matches up the cookie and the URL with that particular user, and then serves that information back to that user. So let's just go ahead and simulate this problem again. So inside the Docker extension here, I'm just going to remove this container. the Nginx container, and then we go ahead and wait for that, and then Docker Compose up again. So bring up that container, a new instance of that container, and then we go ahead and just access our web page again. So not found. So this is in Chrome on this left-hand side here. So we can see by going over to network here, we go to the first page, page 1, and this time we should receive a miss. So xproxy cache miss, and then we reload the page again. It should now be stored in cache, and we get a hit. Okay, so page 1 has been cached. So let's go ahead and do the same thing over here. So this is utilizing Safari. So that's going to need for you to access the development control panel here. Go to the web inspector. So we should receive the same type of information. So let's go ahead and go to P1. So we can have a look at here the headers. Response here, we get the xproxy cache miss. So you can see that this page 1 is stored in cache for this user here in this browser, but because, like we explained earlier about the vary setting here, it's creating an individual cache key that's individual for the individual user. So it's only caching per user and not per page at the moment. So if I refresh this page again, this time we take a look here, we can see that we have cached this page for this individual user. It says xproxy cache hit. Okay, so just to double sure that everything has been deleted, and probably the quickest way is just to remove the Nginx container again, and we'll just rebuild that container. We'll give that a couple of seconds to close down. We'll just rebuild that again, so we get a fresh container. Right, so let's go ahead now and think about how to overcome this problem. So moving back over to Nginx, the default configuration. Inside of our configuration, obviously at the moment what's happening is Nginx recognizes the vary header and then performs actions based upon the settings that have been defined. So we can basically just tell our Nginx server just to ignore. So let's go proxy cache, proxy cache, proxy ignore, sorry. Proxy ignore headers, and then we can just define the header we want to ignore. In this case, it's the vary header. So simply put, now the Nginx server isn't going to be utilizing the vary information to generate the cache key. So let's go ahead and actually we'll just remove our Nginx server again. We'll just start this up again with this new setting. There we go. Right, so with that in place, let's do our experiment again. So we start with 2 fresh windows, one Chrome, one Safari, and let's go ahead and just simulate this. So we go back onto our page here. We'll open up the console. Let's go to page 1. So we're expecting the first page to miss. Yep, so we've got xproxy cache miss here, and then it then gets served from cache. So we now have xproxy cache hit. Right, so let's do the same thing now. This is a fresh incognito private window here in Safari. So let's just run this again. So let's just open up the development tools, the web inspector. So this time we're expecting, because Nginx cache isn't utilizing the vary header settings to generate the cache key, what we should have now is this page is being stored in cache. So anyone who requests this page now, because it's been stored in cache, should get it directly from cache. So let's go ahead and go for P1. And what we're hoping for is to straight away it coming from cache. And you can see here we get the xproxy cache hit straight away, which is indicating it is being directly served from cache. Excellent. So now what we have is a setup where Nginx is serving individual web pages from cache, and that isn't determined, or it isn't dependent upon individual users. It's going to be for a site-wide basis. Any user now that accesses that page will be served from cache. So hopefully what this little exercise has provided is giving you this idea or a deeper understanding of how this cache can be configured for different scenarios here, because we now know that cache can be configured per individual user, and it can now also be configured on like a site-wide or in a global way. And that's where it gets a little bit more interesting, because potentially part of your site you might want to cache, or part of your site or different resources you don't want to cache. Maybe because your page is very dynamic, you don't want to cache that particular page because of that. Maybe you want to have kind of site-wide static pages that are cached, but other dynamic pages that aren't cached. And we can start to control that utilizing the vary header potentially, and other headers. So for example, let's just go for a simple example here, whereby we're going to cache pages if the user isn't logged in, because we're going to make the assumption that if a user isn't logged in, they're just going to our web page, they're browsing our web pages, it's all static. And we make the assumption that if a user's logged in, some of those pages potentially are very dynamic, and we don't want to potentially cache it at this area here. So let's look at how we can set that up in Django. So let's actually log in as a Django user. So we'll go to admin here. I don't know if I've set up an admin user yet. No. Okay, so we haven't set up an admin user. So let's just go back into the project. It's a little bit of a faff at this point. Actually, let's go into the Docker here. No, we may as well set this up. So let's go back into our project. Apologize, there's a little bit of setup here that we're going to need to go through. So we're going to need to make a virtual environment for this. So let's go ahead and do that. So create a virtual environment and then just need to activate that virtual environment. Depending on whether you're on Windows or Mac, it'd be slightly different here. Source, need source. Okay, so that's activated. Let's just pip install Django. And then we want to basically make a Django user. So we just need to cd into Django, the Django folder here where our project is. And then we can go ahead and use Python manage by create new user. Now we will get a problem here. That's not a problem, the allowed host, because we're utilizing environment variables by default here, or at least in this environment, we can't do that with this setup at least. So let's go into our Django demo, go to settings here, and allowed hosts. What we'll do is we'll just add a default, just allow us to get started. So default equals, like we got here, default equals, and let's just put our local loopback address. Okay, so that should allow us now to run create super user, apologies, create super user. And then let's go for admin, no email, password is just admin, and then Y. So we've just created a new user. So let's go back into the browser. Hopefully at this point, we can go ahead and log in. Site cannot be accessed. Looks like there's a problem. Looks like all our containers are down, not a problem. Let's just restart the containers. Okay, so the containers have restarted. So let's just go back and to log in again. So admin. So now we've logged in. Let's just expand this. So let's have a look at our headers here. See if we can see any additional information. So if we look through the headers, what's happened when we log in, Django creates a new cookie for the session ID. So what's happening here is that you logged in, and through the session ID, that uniquely identifies you or helps Django uniquely identify you as someone who is actually logged in. So all we have here is a cookie session ID. With that information in hand, we can then go back into our configuration here. And we can set, for example, proxy cache bypass. And then we can basically tell Nginx if a user is logged in or has, sorry, if the user has this particular information, then basically we want to bypass cache and just request it from the server. And that's obviously the cookie session ID. So that session ID has been added, that cookie session ID has been added to anyone who's logged in. So basically now, anyone who's logged in, the cache is going to be bypassed, and then it's going to be served directly from the server, the information. So let's go ahead and test this new setting out. So I'll just go into the server, and I will just restart the server. That will take up the configuration. So let's go back into our browser. Now we are logged in. We should still be logged in. Yeah, refresh. So let's go into our admin page. Sorry, let's go into our page here. Remember, we should be serving that from cache, but if we go down here, you can see here it says X proxy cache bypass. Because we're logged in, we're bypassing the cache, and that's the behavior that we're experiencing here. So we're not getting this information from cache if we're logged in. So let's just log out and see if that's worked. And then we go back into the page, and you can see this time we get a hit because the page has been cached and we're not logged in. So if you're just thinking about building a static web page, a few different pages, and you want to serve some of those pages from cache using Nginx, then you've got the setup now to do that. And you can see that for logged in users, maybe you're utilizing some more dynamic page and you don't want to serve those pages from cache, in which case you now know how to bypass cache for logged in users. The final section of this tutorial, we're going to discuss how to manage and control cache from a Django project. So not only can we configure cache control from Nginx, we can do this also within Django. Because you may have ultimately a setup where there are multiple cache aspects of your setup, it can be better, or it can be more preferable to configure cache control actually within your Django project. So let's take a look at some of the basic settings that Django provides us to manage the vary header and cache control. So for us to be able to do this, we're going to have to create a new app here. So back in our terminal here, we are inside of this project, I believe. Yep. So let's go ahead and start a new app. Let's go to call this app a demo app. And then we're going to Django, and then we'll just go ahead and register this new app, demo app. Okay, so from there, we now have our demo app. So we now have our views, etc. So in our URLs, we're just going to make a change here. So at the moment, we're just using generic template views to serve the page. So you just want to swap that over, so our new Django app is serving that page. Right, so to do that, let's just go ahead and from demo app, let's import the views. It doesn't exist yet, but it will do shortly. And then what we do is we just serve page 1 from our new Django app, views.homepage. We'll create a new view called homepage. And that sets that up. So that's in demo URLs. So now we're going to serve this URL from our new app. So in our new app here, let's go to our views. So just a simple view to get us started here. So we'll call this homepage. Just standard stuff here, request, and then we'll go for a return. So return render, and then pass back in the request, and then also p1. The actual template. Okay, so that's the template being passed back. So we'll go ahead and inside of our demo app, create a new folder. We'll call that templates. And then inside of here, I reckon, we'll go ahead and, well, actually, I don't think we need to do that. Templates have already been configured on this server for that folder. It's been served from, so we should be good to go there. So here we are then back in the Django documentation. Would you believe it? There is an entry for vary headers, and we can control and manage what is returned in the vary header within our Django project. So if we do have some specific setups whereby we want to cache in certain instances, we can then go ahead and define our vary headers. And we can do that based upon the view, for example. So take this example. So we're bringing views decorators, the vary decorator. And what we can do here is we can utilize this decorator to actually define per view, for example, what we want to return in the vary configuration. So headers, and then let's go for accept language from our example. That's what we had, accept language. So what we're going to do now is add that to our vary header. So let's just see this in action. So let's go ahead and rebuild. So I'm going to do a doc compose up and then build. And let's go back into the browser. I'm just going to refresh the page here and then have a look at the vary settings. So at the moment, in actual fact, we're just returning the cookie. So what we're expecting to see here is now the accept language in addition to the cookie. So just try and keep it as simple as possible. I'm going to just remove everything from Docker and just start again, rebuild again, just to double check everything is working from our new configuration. Okay, remove that. So we go ahead and we just remove absolutely everything. Of course, we don't need to do that, but it just means that there's kind of a level playing field for everyone. Avoid any potential errors. So let's just go back and run up again. So with that done, let's go ahead and just refresh our page again. Let's go ahead and have a look. So this time you can see that we now have vary and we're accepting the language and cookie. So clearly what we've done now is we've added some additional information into vary, and potentially that can be utilized in the levels or different areas of cache to create different configurations. So I apologize, it's hard to give you any concrete examples here. I'm just trying to explore and show what is possible for you to then go off and explore and think about potentially utilizing that in your project. In the Django documentation, there are a few different ways of working with this, and we can also utilize more directly the cache utilities. And from here, we can set up a different type of a way of working, adding the vary information. So we could work with something like this, for example. So actually, we've completely messed that up. Apologies. Let's just return that. There we go. So what we're doing here then, we brought in the patch vary headers. So what we're doing, we're getting the response, and then we're going ahead and we're just adding some additional information here. So within the patch vary headers, we're adding in this case, the user agent into the vary headers and then returning the response. So just a different way of working, a more manual way of working. So while we're talking about the vary header, close by here in the documentation is caching. So here we have, in addition to adding different headers, we also have the options to kind of manage cache more directly here using cache control. So the cache control header can be used to control how caching is performed. And again, remember, caching isn't just on, in this case, our Nginx server. There may be different levels of caching throughout your infrastructure before it hits your server. So it may be important to you that you're able to define different cache settings based upon different URLs or on different views. Delving deeper into the documentation, what we have here is the view decorators cache, and that gives us cache control. So from here, we've got a number of different options. So let's go ahead and use this decorator. So this is going to be cache control, and then we can then define some different parameters here. So the first parameter we can set is public or private, and this essentially allows or forbids caching in public caches. In this case, we have a reverse proxy server. So we can directly tell our caching servers to cache our view or not, utilizing private and public. So I can just call this private and then add that to true. So basically I'm saying that we're not going to cache this view. Two other parameters that we can pass is no cache, which disables caching. That makes a client to perform a request to the original server. And then we also have max age parameter, which essentially says after this time, defined in seconds, cache is considered stale. So let's just go ahead and try this setting here. So I'll go ahead and we'll just rebuild this server. So I'll just remove the web server. Let's go ahead and rebuild that. Okay, so let's give this a go. So P2 should be cacheable. So X cache miss, refresh, and you can see that we are then getting a hit. So P2 or page 2 is being cached. Right, so page 1 then. So we've denied cache here. So you can see that, oh, actually, Xproxy cache is hit here. So potentially we're still serving it from cache. It hasn't been updated. So let's try that. So let's just, for speed, let's just go ahead and remove the Nginx. To remove these containers. And then we go ahead and just rebuild that again. So upbuild. Let's just rebuild those containers. Let's try that out again. So everything comes up and is on. So let's just go ahead and refresh P1. And then this time you can see we have a miss on the Xproxy cache. And then P1 is, again, we have the cache miss. So it looks like this time we've now configured this correctly because we're not actually caching this page. And then let's go for P2. So we can see here we miss and then we hit. So cache is working on page 2, but not page 1. So that goes in line with what we've set up here in this cache control setting. Hopefully that's given you a grounding and you're now confident in starting to think about utilizing Nginx cache to serve Django web pages. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.